All right, so we are starting Module 7 here, which is on evolution. And when we talk about evolution, we have to talk about this guy, Charles Darwin. Darwin was interested in how the different species evolved or came to be on planet Earth, not how life actually got here, and sometimes people confuse the two. So, how did Darwin do what he did? Well, Darwin actually traveled. He was actually the scientist on board a ship called the HMS Beagle. And as they traveled around the world in this ship, he made numerous observations and collected evidence that actually led him to propose this hypothesis, which eventually became a theory on the way life changed over time. Now, Darwin actually almost did not publish his work, but eventually he did, and it became known as the book called On Origin of Species. So, his original hypothesis is now supported by a very large body of evidence and has changed from a hypothesis, like I said, to the theory of evolution. So, as we get started here, let's go through a couple of definitions that we need to. The first one is the term evolution. Evolution is basically just saying that we have change occurring over time. And it is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So, needless to say, you guys know I like cartoons and humor, so this one's kind of funny because it's the female incentive theory for evolution. So basically saying that fish grew feet because the women wanted to have shoes, which is kind of funny. All right, and let's also remind ourselves what a theory is. A theory is a well-supported explanation of events that have occurred in the natural world. So there's a lot of evidence to this, and we have shown that this is true. This isn't something that people are guessing about. So, to put this in context, let's quickly go through some different ideas that actually helped to shape Darwin's thinking, because there were a lot of different possibilities, and then we'll go through his theory itself and then end up with a couple of worksheets here. So, the first couple of scientists that influenced Darwin were James Hutton and Charles Lyell. Basically, they stated that the Earth was many millions of years old. And up until that point, we actually thought the Earth was quite young. But what this did was it actually gave Darwin the timeline he needed for his process to actually take place. It made it feasible. They also said that the processes that change the Earth now are the same as in the present, or same as in the past. So the past and present processes are actually the same. Because if those were different, then maybe we changed a different way earlier than we did now. So some of these processes include things like earthquakes, volcanoes, rain, wind, erosion, even cellular respiration or photosynthesis. The second person who influenced him was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck was a French scientist, and he basically came up with the use or disuse idea. I sometimes call it use it or lose it. And the idea is that you inherit acquired characteristics. So this is actually best illustrated probably with a picture and a little story here. So we have these fiddler crabs. So we have a male fiddler crab here in number 1, and he's trying to attract the females. And so the way they do this is they actually wave one of their claws. Well, what Jean-Baptiste Lamarck said was because he was waving the claw got bigger. And so therefore then when he mated, his offspring got those big claws. Makes kind of sense. Sounds kind of silly, but it makes a little bit of sense. We know that muscles get bigger with use, so why couldn't this happen with something like that? Well, a German scientist named August Weismann actually had a very simple way, kind of cruel, to actually disprove Lamarck. What he did was he took a group of laboratory rats, and male and female, and he chopped off their tails. Now, because he chopped off their tails when they were little, they couldn't use their tails. So the idea was that Lamarck, according to Lamarck, then their offspring should be born without tails. Well, after successive generations of doing this, all of them were born with tails. So Lamarck ended up looking like kind of a silly guy, but there have been people who've still tried to revive his ideas over time. But this actually eliminated a possibility for Darwin, so that he knew that that particular mode was not actually how organisms changed over time. He also was influenced by a social scientist named Thomas Malthus, and Thomas Malthus is actually really important in terms of environmental science. He observed in the slums of England, in London, that the birth rate was actually greater than the death rate. And you would think with people so poor, it would be the opposite, that they would stop trying to have children. But what he was noticing is that as those populations grew unchecked, you had insufficient living space and food availability for those people. So there created competition even among the people, and he introduced this idea of a carrying capacity in which people then would compete. Excuse me, or organisms. So let's go through Darwin's actual theory of natural selection. His theory of natural selection basically states that nature selects genetic variations in a population that will survive. So it's the conditions and the genetics that actually combine to allow someone to survive. And this is what we call survival of the fittest. Those with the fittest genes are able to survive, to reproduce, to pass on those genes to their offspring. And natural selection does apply in things like the wild, like these cheetahs. They tend to, as you can tell with the cartoon, they tend to weed out the sick and the old. Those genes are not fit. If you're sick, you're not fit to survive. If you're old, you've passed your prime and it's time for you to move on. So those are the ones that the cheetahs will actually pick off. The ones that they tend not to get are the ones that are in its prime. And that's what they're kind of lamenting here, is they want one of those really big zebras that have a lot of meat on them. But the thing is, because they're in their prime, they have the genes that will allow them to outsmart and outrun those cheetahs. All right, so there are 6 points here to Darwin's theory. The first one is overproduction. The idea here is that most species produce more offspring than can survive. If you think of something like a frog, think about how many thousands of eggs that they lay. They way overproduce, and not all of them become full-grown frogs. Competition. Since living space and food are limited, organisms have to compete for the necessities. So if you are able to better compete with your, siblings, so to speak, then you will survive. Variation. In other words, there are differences between individuals in a population. If you look up and around at your classmates, we are all the same species, but we are different from each other. So these differences create sometimes the better ability for us to survive. The biggest source of this is in mutations. Adaptations can also exist. In other words, if there's an inherited trait that increases your ability to survive. For instance, with the snowshoe hare. The snowshoe hare is able to change its color based on its surroundings to a certain extent. In the summertime, it's brown, fits in really well with the leaf litter and such on the forest floor. And as the snow comes in, it gradually molds to a white color. That is an adaptation. If that snowshoe hare did not change its color, either in the summer or in the winter, it would not be an advantage, and it doesn't improve its chances for survival. Natural selection. Basically, the environment selects the organisms with the optimal traits to be the parents of the next generation. So again, it's the traits that determine survival, and if you survive, you get to reproduce and pass that on. There is a little bit of genetic luck here. It's not always who's the best, who's the, whatever. There is some luck involved here. So it's not always what we think of as fair with this. And the last point is, he said that all of these lead to speciation. This is where favorable adaptations accumulate and can result in a new species. So when he came out with this, obviously it was kind of a radical thinking. He had to have some evidence. And so, we'll talk about that in the next section of notes here. I'm sorry, I totally lost my place. So let's flip over to your handouts here. And we're going to start by looking at the Galapagos Island tortoises. This is an area to which Charles Darwin is very much associated. So when Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Island, he discovered that similar animals that lived on separate islands had different features. So here you see three different tortoises. Each of them are on different islands in the Galapagos. And the Galapagos is kind of special and unique in that organisms like these tortoises can't just swim from island to island. The currents and the water temperature make it very, very difficult. So they are very much isolated from each other. And that will come into play when we talk about speciation later. So looking at these characteristics of the tortoises eat plants. On one island, the plants grow very close to the ground. Which island would this most likely be? Well, if you look at the three tortoises, the one that's probably best for that would be the Isabel Island tortoise. So explain your answer to question 1. Why did you choose the island that you did? Well, remember, these grow very close to the ground. So the Isabella Island tortoise has a short neck. It also has short legs. And if you look at its shell, it's bigger. It's going to be heavier than the other two. So it really could only eat things that are close to the ground. It is best adapted for that particular environment. So with those things in mind, which island is most likely has sparse vegetation that is hard to reach? So if you look at Pinta and you look at Hood, that's probably going to be Hood. It has a really long neck and its shell is just a little bit smaller and therefore lighter than the Pinta Island tortoise. Now, Charles Darwin is probably best associated, though, with his finches. He took a lot of these finches back with him to study their features. So finches in the Galapagos Islands have beaks adapted to eat the foods available in the birds' habitats. So very much like the tortoises, because of the wind currents, these birds can't fly from island to island. They're too far apart and they just can't do it. So they have to be adapted based on that. So we're going to use the words below to match the finch with the food it is adapted to eat. So it did the first one for us. So it's got a parrot-like beak, and so its main food is fruits. All right, let's see here. All right, so we've got the second one that uses cactus spines, and it lives in trees. So it's inserting these cactus spines into the trees. So it is going to feed on insects that live in dead wood. Because what it does is it inserts the cactus spines and it actually pulls it out and the insects are attached to it, and then it can just eat off the insects. All right, pointed crushing beak that lives on the ground. Now if you compare these two, we've basically got small seeds and then large thick-shelled seeds. This first beak is going to be for the small seeds because it is a smaller beak. And then this one has to be for the larger ones because it is a larger beak itself. So it's able to crush those thick-shelled seeds. Okay. So how does the large crushing beak help the fourth finch survive? What it does is it gives the beak strength to crush the seeds. And then lastly, we need to go back up to here, and it says circle the finch that would be least likely to survive if the insect population decreased. It would probably be this one because it feeds directly on the insects. So that kind of wraps up our introduction here to evolution, and then tomorrow we're going to be talking about the evidence that Darwin had for evolution, and then we're going to get into actually an activity that you will do that ties in with that as well.